You know, every science fiction author, every person who writes genres and whatnot, there are people that go crazy over his books and they meticulously comb through it. And there are also those who find contradictions. And you have those websites that are dedicated to finding contradictions in any series, whether it's like The Lord of the Rings or any of the movies that come out. They'll find, oh look, he was supposed to do this and he did that instead. He was wearing this when he walks in, when he walks out he's wearing that. They find these contradictions, right? Every single genre, every single literature book you'll find this. Here we have the Qur'an that allegedly, our Prophet ﷺ recited it over 23 years. From these people's perspective, he fabricated it. Okay, for 23 years, catering to peace and war, marriage and divorce, child custody and inheritance, talking about the problems of the ummah, sometimes gossip and slander, and the Quran takes care of it. And nothing is found that is contradictory. Now, no doubt, if somebody has a diseased heart and wants to invent contradictions, they will be able to do so. And this is what some people have done. But even a very cursory, very basic knowledge will refute this. Wallahi, it's so ridiculous, it's embarrassing that they could do this. Read the verse. If you just simply have a little bit of knowledge,
well, good evening, everyone. This is Mel here from Sneakers Corner. And as you can see, we have Thaddeus from Reasoned Andrews, who has returned from his sabbatical for the past year. Do you want to tell the audience where you've been and what's in store on your channel?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've spent the last year getting rid of all my hair, and that's how long it took to get hair. No. So last spring or late winter, I was working on a new video. And I spent a lot of time putting it together, and then my hard drive failed on me, and I lost all the work I'd done on that video. I sent it off to professionals to get it repaired. It turns out it couldn't be repaired. And by the time all this had happened, a couple months had gone by, and I was just out of the habit of doing YouTube. And the way I work, it's kind of either I'm all focused on one thing or I'm on something else. It's not like I can't really function where I'm like half in something. So since I was just out of the habit, there was no real reason why I stepped away. I just got out of the habit of doing it. But starting in the fall, the Lord was calling me back into ministry. So I eventually took the initiative and put out a new video. I have a couple of videos out this past week, and I'm working on another one, recorded it today, actually. So I'm definitely back into making content now. And my channel looks at the intersection of Christianity and Islam. I do a little bit of Christian apologetics, but mostly I'm focusing on critiquing Islam.
Excellent. Okay, so that kind of leads us into the topic of the series, which is Quran-tradictions, the contradictions that we can see evident in the Quran. And I suppose anticipating one objection is, surely I'm being hypocritical by suggesting there are contradictions in the Quran. Surely there are contradictions in the Bible, so therefore I'm being hypocritical. But I think there's something that's hugely significant of a difference between the two. First of all, Muslims believe that the Quran has been given word by word, letter by letter, to a prophet called Muhammad via the agency of an angel. And so therefore it has to be all completely from Allah. Whereas with the Bible, all the Christians believe is that the Bible was simply inspired by God. So you have hundreds of writers, they feel they're inspired by God, and there's no expectations that it is word for word the revelation of God in the same literal sense that you have with the Quran. So it's a very different type of thing that we're talking about. And so in terms of the Bible, we would expect that being the work of human beings, you'd find that because human beings differ on lots of things, that there would be contradictions actually in terms of the perspective that the writers might have. For example, if we were to look at the gospel story, you'd find that there's a different emphasis, for example, on different aspects of the story and that kind of thing. So without further ado, Thaddeus, you're going to be talking about one example or one main area of contradiction. So how about if I pass it back to you and let you share?
Sure thing. Well, now, to start with just a couple words of introduction, as Mel said, that Muslims believe the Quran is the literal speech of Allah, which means that this is supposedly God's perfect speech. And in fact, he supposedly composed it before he created human beings. So he had, all of eternity to get it right. So we'd expect that it doesn't contain any contradictions, that it speaks to all people of all times, doesn't have any kind of errors. But when we actually look at the Quran, we see something that looks like it was written by someone who lived in the 7th century, probably in Arabia. We see that the Quran is very confused about human history. It gets a number of scientific facts wrong. It has moral errors, internal contradictions, and in some cases, even grammatical errors, where, for example, the subject and the verb, they don't agree in number. And you'll hear about some of these things in later videos. Now, for some of these things, Muslims can offer excuses. They can say, well, morals are somewhat subjective. You're just imposing your own morals. God knows what the best morals are. Or they'll say, well, our understanding of science can change. We can learn new things about history. Maybe the Quran will be proven right, or maybe you're misreading it. On internal contradictions, they'll offer explanations. Sometimes they work, sometimes they really don't. Like, for example, they'll say that, well, there's some stories say there's 6 days of creation. Others say there's 8. One Muslim might say that, well, 6 is smaller than 8. So he just left some of the days out in that version of the story. It wasn't trying to tell you everything. But it doesn't really work, because this is supposedly the speech of God. If it was two humans talking about their own perspective on history, sure, they'd talk about different things. But this is supposed to be the same author of both passages, and he's supposed to be teaching the same thing in both. So why does he get that wrong? But in any case, there's one thing that Muslims definitely can't argue about, at least if they're being honest, and that's logic. Logic is very objective. It's either true or it's false. There's not really any middle ground. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to point out a logical error in the Quran. So what we have is Surah 482. I'll go ahead and put that up on the screen in context. It's always important to look at any literary work in its context to get a good idea of what the author is intending to say. Now, honestly, the Quran doesn't have a huge amount of context, and even Muslims will just take verses out in isolation and treat them as if they're a complete thought. But I think it's still beneficial to look at the context. So we're going to start with 480 here. He who obeys the messenger has obeyed Allah, but those who turn away, we have not sent over them as a guardian. And they say, we pledge obedience. But when they leave you, a group of them spend the night determining to do other than what you say. But Allah records what they plan by night. So leave them alone and rely upon Allah. And sufficient is Allah as disposer of affairs. Then do they not reflect upon the Quran? If it had been from any other than Allah, they would have found within it much contradiction. So we're going to focus on this last part here, which is what's in logic known as a conditional statement. If something, then something else. But we can see from the context here that this is kind of being offered as a challenge. It's being offered as a challenge to a group of perhaps Muslims that are being disobedient, or perhaps unbelievers, however you want to look at this group. But it's being offered to a people who don't seem to really believe in the Quran. And they're being challenged. Look at the Quran. And when you do this thing, you'll see that it must have been from Allah or from God. So we're going to test whether that's actually true.
And just say, just before you move on, if our audience can just focus on the word much, prior to the word contradictions, it's not black and white there. It's a kind of a fudge there on the test to find out if it's true or not. How much is much? It's a bit like saying there'll be some contradiction. Well, even I think some contradiction would be a clearer way of determining it. So you could say, well, if you find any contradiction, clearly that's the test done at that point. But much is too vague.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that the author of the Quran is all that confident in the lack of contradictions in it.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at the Quran, or really any work that's been translated from a foreign language, it's probably a good idea to look at a few different translations. Uh, there's not usually a one-to-one correspondence between words, between languages, so different translations may capture different nuances of what's being said. And frankly, in the case of the Quran, a lot of times translators purposely hide things that are in the Arabic because they know they're problematic and they don't want their audience that doesn't know Arabic to know about these things. In any case, we already looked at Sahih International. If it had been from any other than Allah, they would have found within it much contradiction. Pickthall says if it had been from other than Allah, they would have found therein much incongruity. Yusuf Ali, had it been from other than Allah, they would have surely found therein much discrepancy. These first three are all very popular translations. They're widely used by Muslims, but I also like to always look at the Arbery translation. Arbery was not a Muslim. He's just a scholar of Arabic, and he did his own translation. So he didn't have any incentive to hide things. So I always look at his translation. Often the language is somewhat archaic, but nonetheless, it often reveals nuances that the Muslim authors have intentionally removed. If it had been from other than God, surely they would have found in it much inconsistency. So we can see if all four of these translations are basically saying the same thing. They use a different word, inconsistency, contradiction, whatever, but the idea is the same in all of them. So like I said previously, what we have here is a conditional statement. The first part of a conditional statement is the hypothesis, if something, and the second part is called the conclusion, then something else. So I think what we first need to do, though, is we need to look at what the verse is not saying. What most Muslims read this verse as saying is, if they had found within it much contradiction, it was from other than Allah. However, this isn't logically equivalent. This is what's known as the converse, where you take the conclusion and the hypothesis and you reverse the two. When you say that they are logically equivalent, you're committing a specific logical fallacy known as affirming the consequent. You are taking the conclusion and you're saying because the conclusion is true, the hypothesis must be true, which is what Muslims tend to do with this verse. But that's incorrect. That's not how we should view the verse. Whoops, didn't mean to zoom in. So we can see why this doesn't work by looking at a logically equivalent statement. This statement's in the exact same form, but I've changed the subject. If this video had been from any other than Sneakers Corner, it would contain much Buddhism. And we compare that with if this video had contained much Buddhism, it wouldn't be from Sneakers Corner. Now, the second one here is true. Sneakers Corner doesn't have any videos devoted to Buddhism. Mel will point out that maybe there's a couple statements, brief statements about Buddhism, but don't worry, I put the word much in there, so we're still safe.
Yeah.
And so that one's true. But if we look at this first one, if this video had been from any other than Sneakers Corner, it would contain much Buddhism. Now, I'm sure you've all been on YouTube and you've all seen that there are videos that are not about Buddhism that were not released by this channel. In fact, there's many videos that don't talk about religion at all and weren't released by this channel. So we can see that not every video that doesn't contain much Buddhism was released by Sneakers Corner. So we can see why the two are not logically equivalent. Finally, we need to go back to the verse and say, well, what is it saying then? And the way it's worded can be confusing due to the multiple negative aspects, not this, not that. It can get a little confusing, but what we can do is we can look at the contrapositive, which is a logically equivalent way of reversing the hypothesis and conclusion, but you have to negate both of them. So these two statements are logically equivalent. If it had been from any other than Allah, they would have found within it much contradiction. Is logically equivalent to if they found within this not much contradiction, it would be from Allah. So any thoughts you'd like to add, Mel, at this point?
It it isn't always the case that something that has not much contradiction means that it must be from Allah. So, for example, a telephone book doesn't have much contradiction. You could have a novel that's completely fictional that doesn't have any internal contradictions, but that doesn't mean it's from Allah. So the reverse doesn't seem to work. That's what I would say.
Right. So these two statements are equivalent. So if the second one doesn't work, then the first one also doesn't work. And of course, it's probably pretty obvious that the second one's false, but we're going to go ahead and treat it seriously for a moment and take the Muslim side on this and say, all right, so anything that doesn't contain a lot of contradiction is from Allah. And in fact, I don't know how to define a lot. So I'm just going to make it even simpler. I'm going to say anything that doesn't contain any contradiction whatsoever. So anything with zero contradictions is from Allah if we take this verse seriously. If it doesn't have any contradictions, it definitely doesn't have much. So I'm actually making the test harder. So if this harder version is false, then the easier version must also be false. So if we're going to take this seriously, then I'd like to present to you a new Islamic text that I found, green eggs and ham. Are you familiar with green eggs and ham?
I'm not. I think I've missed out on my reading choice.
That's all right. I assure you that the book does not contain any internal contradiction, and it's not about anything in the real world, so it can't contradict objective reality either. If Muslims disagree, feel free to point out any errors in green eggs and ham in the comment section, but if they can't, and they're taking the Quran seriously, then I suggest they take this as a new Islamic text that's on the same level as the Quran.
Allah can't make an error, so this must be the case.
Yeah, I mean, human beings are going to automatically have errors in the text if they write it. So if there's no errors, Allah wrote it. That's what the Quran's saying, and I'm taking that seriously. Now, Muslims probably aren't going to be taking green eggs and ham into their scriptures anytime soon. So what they're going to do instead is they're going to commit a different fallacy, which is special pleading. They're going to say, I acknowledge that not all books without error are from Allah, but the Quran is true because it was only talking about the Quran. It was saying if the Quran contained errors, then the Quran would be from Allah. But this is special pleading. It's saying, in general, a statement's false, but in one specific case, it's true. So to provide an illustration of why special pleading is a fallacy and you can't do it, I'm going to come up with this hypothetical here where I've invented a new sect of Islam. In my particular sect of Islam, we have basically the same teachings as traditional Islam. We revere Muhammad as the last and most special of all the prophets, who's exactly the same as every prophet who came before him according to doctrine. We reject all the pagan practices, except the ones that Muhammad endorsed, such as kissing stones and circling the Kaaba. We accept the Quran and all the Hadith acceptable to modern culture, as well as green eggs and ham and other important works of literature that contain no errors. There is one difference between my sect and traditional Islam. We revere the holy apple because we recognize that Jibril appeared to Adam and he made him the first prophet through the sacred apple. So would you like to join this cult, Mel? We call ourselves the Fruities, which I think you'll agree is the appropriate name for Islam. And we have the same policy as regular Islam in that we offer you unlimited carnal pleasure when you join us. And if you don't join us, then we're going to violently subjugate you and make your life miserable. So what do you think? Should you join?
I wasn't going to, but that last bit kind of has strongly persuaded me that it would be the good thing to do.
Excellent. I'm very glad to hear that. So here's where the SpongeBob narrator comes on and says, one day later. So Mel, I hear that you've been teaching objective facts about the early history of Islam, which unfortunately is causing Muslims to doubt the truth of the standard narrative, which, as we know, was invented more than 200 years after Muhammad lived, but is completely reliable in every way. or as I like to call this activity, making mischief in the land. Now, I'm going to bring you back into Islam right now. Have you not pondered on this holy apple? If it were not proof of Islam, the fruity version of Islam, would it surely not contain much blue?
I have a problem. I think you're holding, in fact, a banana.
Well, what do you mean? This is a fruit, and it's not blue. So it must be an apple, and Islam must be true.
Well, I would readily admit it is not blue, but it looks very much like a banana to me.
Well, I have another argument to win you over. What about this apple? Have you seen its unsurpassed taste? If it were not the most tasty fruit, then surely it wouldn't come from Allah. So it must be proof of his authorship of this fruit.
Well, I would readily admit it's very tasty, and it at least has the shape correct. But again, I would have to deny that this is an apple indeed.
All right. Well, I admit that argument wasn't so good. I mean, there's lots of tasty things that don't come from God. So, but I'm going to go back to my original argument. I'm going to say, yeah, I acknowledge that it's not true that all fruit that aren't blue are apples. But in this particular case, if this particular fruit were not blue, then it would be an apple, and it's definitely proof of the fruity teachings of Islam, don't you think?
So it's basically a special pleading. Just in this case, your logic works, essentially.
Exactly, and this is why we can't do special pleading. Yeah. It makes the statement meaningless. If you say it's not true in general, but it's true in this one specific case, then you're making a meaningless statement. And remember that the context of this verse is supposedly supposed to convince unbelievers or disobedient Muslims, however you want to look at that. So it has to be offering them something that they can actually look at. And if you're saying it's only true of the Quran, well, they don't believe in the Quran, so you're making a meaningless statement. So what Muslims are going to, if Muslims want to avoid special pleading, they're going to have to come up with some class of objects. Maybe it's not all books, but they're going to have to come up with some class of books that always contain errors if they're not from Allah. So I've proposed this to a number of Muslims, and once they finally understand the point, they'll come up with some reasons of why the Quran must be different than other books. And one of the first things that they'll suggest is that it was revealed over 28 years, and surely this long time span of being revealed means it's going to contain some errors. What do you think about that argument?
Well, I think it's a weak argument, because surely they could have just written it down, and there should be no scope for errors seeping in. Plus, if it's from Allah, surely Allah can protect his words. So therefore, I can't accept that as an excuse for the errors, to be honest.
Yeah, and I'll add that we have this little thing called abrogation, where, say, in one part of the Quran, it says you're allowed to drink alcohol, and then later in the Quran, or maybe not later as in following the text line by line, but was revealed later, because it's not printed in the order that it was revealed. Allah decides that Muslims can't have alcohol, and Muslims will say, well, this is because Allah revealed this easier doctrine first and then this harder one later. Well, fine, I'll accept that explanation, but it means that it being revealed over time actually allows for contradictions. So it doesn't seem like a human author couldn't just do the same thing and say, well, you found that contradiction after the fact, but that's on purpose, because that later revelation was more important than the earlier one. That earlier one was just temporary. So any human could do the same thing with any text.
I think one of the things to point out about Quran-tradictions like that one is that if you're trying to suggest a reason for that, okay, so Muslims would say, well, this is a development that Allah is bringing about, okay, because the people weren't ready like 5 months ago for this new teaching, but now suddenly they're ready for it. So now we've just got to suddenly black is white and white is black. So therefore now this is the new thing. But a much simpler explanation is that these contrary texts in the Quran are just evidence that there were multiple authors writing at different times, and they are human authors, and that's what it suggests. So if people are just logical about what they're looking at and say, well, what exactly are we seeing? Well, we're seeing different opinions or contrary ideas. That would suggest that if you have contrary opinions, unless you're dealing with a schizophrenic, which is not inconceivable, you're more likely seeing evidence of authorship by different people. And the fact that they have patched it together into one book and were either unaware that there's contradictions or didn't care about the contradictions, I don't know which, kind of leaves Muslims in a really kind of awkward situation now, because they got away with it for centuries because no one dared critique the Quran, because critiquing the Quran led to your dismemberment of your head from your shoulders, whereas now people can do it, and there is no convincing response that I've ever seen from Muslims on this issue. They beat around the bush. They just make bigger and bigger claims without actually offering any credible evidence. That's what I would say on that one.
Yeah, I would tend to agree that the Quran is probably written by multiple authors. We could also, maybe not so much for different doctrinal teachings, but things like, 8 days or 6 days of creation. We can also just say that the author forgot what he said earlier and then revealed something different. Except he was just making it up all along. In any case, another excuse that Muslims will say is, well, Green Eggs and Ham is a pretty short book, but the Quran is really long. So that's why you don't find any contradictions in Green Eggs and Ham, but you find them in the Quran. What do you think about the length argument?
Yeah, I would have thought that the length of a book should not have any relevance. If something is from God, then it should have no contradictions. It's not like, it's too much of a challenge to write something without contradictions for over 300 pages. I'm sure Tolkien has managed to do a pretty good job over thousands of pages, to avoid contradictions. I think there may be some minor contradictions actually in Tolkien's, but there are plenty of fictional writers that have actually done a pretty good job. In fact, a way better job at eliminating contradictions than the Quran ever did. The fact is, it's not that there is just some contradictions. There are so many contradictions in the Quran. I've named the series Quran-tradictions because I'm confident that this could be this never-ending series that we never get to the end of, because we keep discovering more and more. I think it's a gift that keeps giving,
Yeah, I have a funny story on that. Yesterday, someone said, how do you keep finding errors in the Quran? And I said, as a joke, how do you find an error in the Quran? Well, you open to a random page and you point. And so I was just joking, but then I went ahead and I tried out my theory, and I opened to a random page and pointed, and I landed on a verse with a pretty obvious scientific error. I said that that Allah spoke to the bees, that I've made your houses, and I've given you all these fruits to eat. And then it goes on to say, and the bees produce a delicious drink from their bellies. And I'm like, bees don't eat fruits. So I literally just pointed to a random verse, and I found it a scientific error in the Quran. I mean,
that's incredible. So yeah,
of course, not every verse has one, but there are like literally hundreds of errors in the Quran.
Yeah. I think we should probably give a shout out to Apostate Prophet, who has done an amazing video looking at all the scientific errors in the Quran. So I think we'll put a link up here just so people can take a look at that. If you need further convincing that there are actually loads of scientific contradictions in the Quran. Yeah,
absolutely. So getting back, we're saying that we're talking about the length. And earlier you said that a phone book doesn't contain any contradictions. And that's certainly true. It doesn't say, so-and-so's phone number is this and this, unless it's listing two phone numbers they have, in which case they're both true. I mean, it's probably out of date. It probably has a few wrong phone numbers. But how about this? I could download the password database for Gmail in principle. Obviously, I can't literally, but I can, in principle, could download it. And I guarantee that every single password in Google's database for Gmail users is correct. They don't have any inaccurate passwords in their database. And that database is, if you printed it out, I'm sure it's longer than any book any human being has written, because they have literally close to 1 billion users.
Yeah, that's true.
So another option the Muslim will give is that the Quran is a religious text and that it speaks about the supernatural world. So what do you think about that one?
That it is a supernatural text because it speaks about the supernatural world. Well, we just mentioned about Tolkien. I suppose we could talk about Harry Potter, that kind of delves into supernatural things. There are whole genres of books dealing with the supernatural worlds, all of which are fictional. So I don't think that's convincing.
Yeah, and I don't actually understand what this one's supposed to, why anyone would even think that this is a reason, because we can at least test internal contradictions and we can test things about objective reality, but we can't actually test any statements the Quran makes about the supernatural world, at least not while we're living. So how in the world does it, putting in a bunch of things we can't test, mean that it would have contradictions? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
The final one that typically is offered, and this might be the most popular of all the explanations, is that the Quran is revered by millions of Muslims. And since it's revered by so many people, this makes it a special book and puts it in its own category. So then the statement can be true about only the Quran.
So you're saying that just because there are millions of people who like a particular book, therefore it must be what it says it is. Like, for example, we could have a million people in the world who love a particular football club, okay, who all believe that this is the best football club in the world. But it actually may not be. It may be a rubbish football team. It's just that they have got huge reverence for this team. They are not fair weather supporters. These are people who well, maybe they are, but that they will support this team regardless of how they're doing. So there's no connection there.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Plus, if we take this seriously, then I guess that means the Quran was false when it was first revered, and only Muhammad and like his 5 close friends believed it was true. So thank you for proving that the Quran was originally false, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Plus, there's
so
also the fact that if a person is going to say, well, the reason why we should trust the Quran is because there's a huge number of people who believe that it is true, so they're convinced it's true. But then what you also have to factor in is there's an even larger population in the world who think it is false. So if the logic is correct, then you would have to go with the larger number of people and just say, well, majority rules. The majority of the world has decided that the Quran is false and they will not follow this religion, so therefore it must be a false religion. That logic follows.
Absolutely. So these are all the examples that I've basically ever encountered by Muslims trying to avoid special pleading. But if other Muslims have other suggestions of why it makes the Quran unique, they can put those in the comments and I'll be happy to take a look at their reasoning. But until then, I think we can only conclude that the God of Islam doesn't understand logic. And I think we need to remember that this verse was proposed as a test to people who were not following Muhammad properly, who didn't believe in him. So this is supposed to be a test that unbelievers can do. And the God of Islam proposes a test that doesn't make any sense to people who aren't believers in the Quran already. So I guess the Muslim could suggest that, well, it doesn't work in your logic, but God has a different kind of logic. Well, if you want to say that the God of Islam is illogical and doesn't make any sense, well, I mean, I guess I agree with that, but this was proposed as a way for unbelievers to test the Quran. So if the God of Islam actually understood the people he was giving the test to, he would phrase it in a way that makes sense to them, I would have to think. I mean, what do you think, Mel?
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a faulty argument. I think if if you're going to say that logic is the reason, an argument based on logic is the reason why you should believe in something, but then turn around and say, well, but there's a different logic for Allah. That doesn't make sense. So you're kind of automatically saying, well, actually, that whole argument is irrelevant because there's a different logic for Allah. I don't think that argument works, and it's kind of typical of so many of the arguments that Muslims make. Like, for example, it reminds me very much of the fact that Muslims believe that there was a real Bible other than the one we currently have, a mystical, mysterious, unseen Bible, and that's the one that's correct, whereas the one we actually physically have is not the one that the Quran is referring to. So when Muhammad in the Quran is saying that the Old Testament and the New Testament essentially affirms what he's saying, right? Muslims are saying, well, yeah, that was a different Bible that Muhammad was talking about. But when we propose Bibles that we do have from the 7th century, ones that, presuming Muhammad was a real person, historical person, and so on, which there's a big question mark over, that argument doesn't work because we find that the Bible that we have from the 7th century is pretty much the same as it is today. But the problem is the Bible contradicts the Quran in major ways, and Islam. It doesn't support Islam. In fact, it contradicts Islam, and that's a problem. So I would say, yeah, there's a lot of times where Muslims point to something that you can't actually examine. So like Allah's logic, well, you can't examine that because it's beyond your perception. The claims about paradise and hell and so on, you can't examine those either because they're beyond our current experience. So this is a very useful way of getting around any critical examination of the ideas of Islam, I would say.
Yeah, or they appeal to the elegance / tastiness of the Quran and say that it's more elegant than any other book, which is a completely subjective criteria. And then they'll say, well, no one can produce something like it. And you're like, okay, give me some objective criteria to produce something like it. And I've asked many Muslims that exact thing, and none has ever even replied to me. They've never even bothered to try because they know it's a game. They say you can't produce anything like it, and they've already decided anything you produce is not like it. So it's not a test at all. It's just a completely circular argument.
Yeah. I don't know. I know there have been various attempts to write fake surahs and so on. I think what would make a very compelling case for the fact that in fact you can write something like it is actually offer text as if it were from the Quran, and for Muslims to maybe who are not very familiar with the Quran to get fooled by that. I think that in itself would be a pretty strong case. If you could fool 100 Muslims into thinking that some verses are actually from the Quran, I think you've won the case there,
Yeah, and that's how I would propose some objective criteria. I'd say, okay, you compose your verse, and then we'll read a passage from the Quran, and we'll read yours, and we'll not tell Muslims which one's which, and we'll see how many people are tricked and to thinking that they're both from the Quran or that they misidentify it, whatever. That would be an objective test, but I'm not aware of any Muslim that has ever been willing to accept the results of that test. And I do know that people have experimented where they read a fake Quran in public, and Muslims were like, thank you for reading the Quran to us. Because obviously most Muslims don't actually know what the Arabic words mean, and they're responding to the very elegant, skilled orator delivering it. It has nothing to do with the words themselves.
Yeah. There's an interesting thing that I looked at before, which is to do with artificial intelligence. And what they currently can do is they can train computers to create fake photos, right? Just literally just from its computer learning knowledge, and then create an examination of that using another form of AI. And so the other AI's job is to detect if it's fake or real. And so if it gets wrong, it kind of goes back to square one and then tries another one, and it keeps going. So it's basically two AIs competing with each other. But what happened was that eventually both of them got so good that they were producing fake photos that actually were indistinguishable from real ones. So that's how they learn. So I would say you could easily use artificial intelligence to create fake Qurans. You train it up to actually mimic the style of the Quran. And I'm sure there are plenty of computer experts who are watching the video who would confirm that that is the case, that you can literally analyze and parse the Quran and use it as a learning tool in order to get AI to create very realistic sounding surahs and ayahs and so on. Yeah,
absolutely. So getting back to the original test, I said that some of those examples I offered about why it wouldn't be special pleading are the most popular thing Muslim, some say in response, but actually the most popular thing they say in response by far is the Bible is corrupted. The Bible has contradictions. The Bible this, the Bible that. And this is, well, one, it's just a completely invalid logical argument to begin with. Even if the Bible was completely false, it would mean absolutely nothing about the truth of the Quran. So they're just avoiding the subject. But I think it's a good idea to end with this same way we began, kind of talking about the difference between the Christian view of the Bible and the Muslim view of Scripture, of the Quran. So as you said, that Christians view the Bible as written by human beings under the inspiration of God. There are a few isolated passages which are said to be the literal speech of God, but those are few and far between. Like, when Moses received the 10 commandments, God literally spoke to him. But those are, that's like far less than 1% of the Bible. So by and large, it's written by human beings under the inspiration of God, according to the Christian belief, which means that they conveyed true information, but they conveyed it in a way that was relevant to their culture, and God allowed them the freedom to express their own humanity through the text. So if we have two authors describing the same event and they give different details about it, well, that's a mark of authenticity. This is what real eyewitness testimony looks like. If it was a conspiracy or they're just copying from one another, then they would describe the same event in the same exact way. And if they're both just totally making stuff up, they wouldn't describe the same event at all because they would have no knowledge of what the other person wrote. So these, interlocking accounts that they contain different information, but they don't contain incompatible information necessarily. Earlier, I talked about the 6 days of creation versus the 8 days of creation in the Quran. Well, one of the most popular irrefutable contradictions in the Bible is that one resurrection account says that there was an angel there, and a different account says there was 2 angels there. Well, one angel is not 2 angels. They're completely contradictory. Well, no, one author was just conveying the idea that there was angels there and not telling you he didn't intend to say there was precisely 1 angel. The other author thought it was important that there was precisely 2, so he said 2. And I think you can see the difference between that and the 8 days thing. The Quran defender can't really say that the 8 days of creation include the 6 because they're both the same author, both with supposedly the same perspective. Neither one observing creation taking place, whereas the Bible is saying, these are 2 different eyewitness accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. And so they observed different things, but they observed compatible things.
I think it just to say something that's kind of relevant to that. In a court case, if you were asked to give your account and say, well, okay, let's say it was you witnessed one criminal running away, right? But you were also aware that there were actually 2 criminals running away because while you were there on the scene, someone said, oh, there was a second person there. So you're aware that there were 2, but you actually only saw one of them. And then you, in a court case, you say, well, yes, I only saw one, but I'm aware that there were two. And the judge will say, well, we can't accept that because that's hearsay. So you're including hearsay. So that's where I would go, with that as just as an extra point there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the different explanations are possible, and we can discuss which explanation's the best. But the point is that the Christian view of Scripture allows it to be written by human beings, which means that a difference or a discrepancy or a contradiction, however you want to phrase it, isn't necessarily proof that the text is untrue. When a historian looks at secular history, if they find that the author said different things at different times, or different authors said different things about the same event at the same times, their first assumption is that it's different perspectives of the same event. They only rule one person out when they have a really good reason to. They don't say, well, they disagreed on some minor details, so this event didn't happen. They say, well, they disagree on some minor details, which means it's more likely that this is a true event because they're not getting this information from each other. So in actuality, I know that these things bother Christians, but they shouldn't. When they have a proper understanding of the text, they can see that God has allowed this because it actually enhances the reliability of the text. The Muslim...
Just to reaffirm really the point here is, it shows, these sort of contradictions are acceptable because they show that there isn't conspiracy taking hold, because you could easily get a couple of people together, like, okay, here's what we're going to tell the authorities, and rehearse the story. So everything is perfect. Everything matches perfectly. You got the same wording. You got the same points. It's exactly the same in every case. That never happens in reality. So there's rehearsal, and there's also, even if you had just one witness, and let's say you had one witness, right? So let's say, in the case of someone who had rehearsed their story, every time you asked them to tell the story, they would tell it exactly the same every time. But if it's someone who is trying to remember events, and I've even tested it on myself in terms of thinking about events, each time that you go through it, you're going to recall different aspects of it because it's not rehearsed, it's not learned off. You're just literally just saying, at that moment in time when you're recalling, certain things will come to mind that you can remember, and then other things that at that moment in time you think, well, that isn't really that important, so leave out that detail, but this detail I want to emphasize because it seems important in that moment. So there's a lot of that going on. So I think it's not necessarily a bad thing that there are contradictions in terms of witness accounts. But if the argument is that there's one author, and that author is an infinite being with infinite intelligence, infinite power, and so forth, and presumably benevolent as well, so hasn't got a malicious bone in his body, let's say. Well, that's probably a bad metaphor, but the traditional idea of God, essentially, then there's no scope for contradictions. If it's literally from a being like that, you cannot have contradictions. It's a different kettle of fish.
Exactly. You perfectly summarized what I was going to say. But these kinds of explanations do not work for the Quran, because the Muslim belief about the Quran, unless you're talking like extremely liberal Muslim that most Muslims would say is not a real Muslim, they're going to say that the Quran is the literal speech of Allah, which means it can't be multiple eyewitnesses. It can't contain minor discrepancies that reflect different perspectives, because there's one perspective, one perfect author. The text should be perfect. And so I would just tell Muslims, stop trying to use the Bible as an excuse to deal with what Islam actually says. If you leave Islam, if you've realized that Islam is not true based on contradictions, based on scientific errors, based on the horrific moral teachings, whatever reason, once you've decided that, then you can examine whether the Christian claim makes any sense. But until you've left Islam, it doesn't make any sense to avoid talking about the difficulties in your own religion by saying, well, some other religion has problems, because you're just avoiding the issue. You're not actually dealing with anything.
Yeah. It's a bit like someone who's in trouble saying, well, you think what I'm doing is wrong. What about those other people? They've done a lot worse than me. So, you know, it's deflection, you know. Yeah, absolutely. And you see it all the time. It's the excuse. It's usually Christianity is the one that is pointed to, you know, as a get out of jail sort of excuse for whatever is in Islam.
Definitely. So I think that pretty much covers it today, although I will offer one final hope for Muslims to escape this verse. The verse does say much contradiction in the Quran, and I've only pointed out one logical contradiction. So I suppose the verse could still be true if there weren't any other contradictions in the Quran. So you'll have to tune into the rest of the series to find out about more contradictions in the Quran.
Excellent. Thaddeus, thank you very much for coming on the channel. It's been very enlightening, very interesting, and lots of food for thought. I think you've set up the question nicely there. Fruit, no, apples and pears and bananas and oranges. And, yeah. So I think it's incumbent, I think, on Muslims to see the logical flaws that's really in evidence there in the Quran. They should at least acknowledge that much contradiction is a fudge. It isn't a test. If you were to set up a proper test to see if something is true or false, you would not be using a phrase like much contradiction. So that in itself has got all the hallmarks of a human author and not of a divine being that you could even remotely refer to as intelligent. So on that note, thank you for watching, everybody, and hope to have Thaddeus back again sometime soon. Thanks for watching.
God bless.